That's my man. Don't even talk to him. Don't even look at him. Stay away from him. Hello and welcome to Crime Bytes, the show where we talk about some truly bizarre and disturbing crime cases. My name is Liz and today is True Crime Tuesday. So we're back with our second episode of our Sinful Summer series, and today we are going to focus on the sin of anger. I've got my no-nonsense bull terrier shirt on, and I don't know if you can see, he just kind of says, nope. And that's definitely the mood I'm in after preparing for today's episode. Today's case is another one where we see a lifelong victim of abuse become a perpetrator. But in today's case, our perpetrator takes her rage out on someone who basically didn't do anything to them, or at least nothing to deserve what happened to them. We're going to start by meeting 3 students at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. Let me paint a picture of this center for you first. Job Corps is a program that is run by the U.S. Department of Labor. It provides free education as well as vocational training to people aged 16 to 24 with limited resources. It was developed in the 60s to help combat unemployment and still exists today. It has done a lot of good throughout its existence. However, unfortunately, today's case is going to center around 3 individuals who met at a Job Corps center in Knoxville, Tennessee. This particular Job Corps wasn't in the best neighborhood. It was a residential campus converted from an old Holiday Inn, which sounds kind of cool until you saw the barbed wire fence running around the perimeter. To keep people with ill intent out is what they said, but because we're working with people who are of lesser means, our characters today are going to be a tad rough around the edges. Okay, maybe a bit more than a tad. So our first student is Colleen. Colleen is originally from Orange Park, Florida, where she lived with her mother, stepfather, and younger sister. In 1994, because her family was unable to send her to college and she had a learning disability that made it difficult for her to finish high school, she ended up enrolling in Job Corps so that she could still get the education she wanted to make a better life for herself. She was interested in studying computers, which her closest Job Corps was in Jacksonville. It didn't have that program. So this is what brought her to the Knoxville, Tennessee campus. Next we have Tadaryl. Tadaryl was a 9th grade high school dropout from Memphis, Tennessee, who had a small rap sheet before he joined Job Corps. He was raised by his single mother, who encouraged him to join Job Corps and get his life back on track, which he did. Finally, let's meet Christa. Christa had a rougher upbringing. She bounced around from house to house while she was growing up, which, along with some other events, ended up resulting in her being sent to a juvenile facility in the 10th grade, where she became interested in Job Corps. So she will be our 3rd student in today's story, who joins Job Corps in Knoxville, Tennessee in the fall of 1994. Christa would become interested in Tadaryl after he showed her a picture that his friend had drawn that looked just like her, and told her that this was the woman he dreamed he was meant to be with, and had his friend draw the description, and wow, it was her. This worked, and the two would begin their own fairly tumultuous relationship. One concerning thing that bonded the pair was a mutual interest in Satanism and the occult. One of the problems that Tadaryl and Christa would face was either Christa's misplaced jealousy, Tadaryl's wandering eye, or a combination of both of these things. Oh man, I don't know if you've ever been in this type of toxic relationship. If you have, I'm really sorry. It's usually generally a recipe for disaster, and this would prove to be no exception because Christa didn't like how friendly Colleen was with Tadaryl. It became a point of contention between the couple, actually between all 3 of the students, because Christa was not quiet about how much she detested Colleen. Then something would happen or wouldn't happen over Thanksgiving break, and that's where I was trying to decide the motive for today's case, but I ended up keeping it at anger, and I think you'll see why. Apparently during Thanksgiving break, Tadaryl and Colleen would hook up while Christa was home for the weekend. Not only that, Tadaryl would tell Christa and then say Colleen was even more obsessed with him. She wouldn't leave him alone, and that they really should take care of her. Now, there are conflicting sources whether the pair actually hooked up or if Tadaryl started a rumor or if Christa thought they hooked up while she was gone. The point was, and the point that really matters here, is that Christa thought that they hooked up while she was gone. And anger does not even begin to describe how Christa felt or what she did in response to this. Well, she waited and let the anger fester into a murderous rage for about a month and a half first. She would harass and stalk Colleen during this month, and Colleen was at the verge of leaving Job Corps because it had become so bad. But unfortunately, she ended up deciding to stick things out. Whether or not Colleen and Tadaryl did or did not hook up is almost irrelevant because nothing excuses what happens next. So on January 12th of 1995, Christa and Tadaryl would ask Colleen and another classmate named Shadala if they wanted to all go out in the woods and smoke some weed and kind of chill out and let bygones be bygones, you know. And being kind of just a nice person and not wanting any more trouble, Colleen said, okay, let's do it. The four of them headed out into the nearby forest. After they kind of got swallowed up into the forest, Colleen began to feel a little uneasy. The tension she was trying to let go of started to feel thicker and thicker until she kind of couldn't take it anymore. She didn't even see Shadala anymore, which completely escalated the feeling she was trying to suppress. "There's not any weed here, is there?" she said slowly, at which point Christa punched her. Now, Christa would later claim that she only meant to jump Colleen and kind of scare her away from Tadaryl, and that things had gotten out of hand, but she came with a box cutter and a meat cleaver in her pocket. And just before, the day before, witnesses would state that Tadaryl had told them that he needed to offer a human sacrifice because the celestial bodies were in alignment. So this seems pretty premeditated here. And what happens next is just beyond horrific and sad. There was no weed, Colleen was correct. Instead, Christa would confront her yet again in an extremely aggressive manner. And when Colleen would deny the accusations and kind of look to Tadaryl for affirmation, Christa would grab her by the hair and slam her face into her knee. Colleen was shocked, but before she could register what was going on, Christa would throw her to the ground and just start punching and kicking her. At this point, Colleen was just sort of whimpering on the ground, begging them to stop, asking them why they were doing this, when something inside of her just told her she needed to get out of there. So she would pull herself to her feet and try to run, at which point either Tadaryl or Shadala, it's not quite clear which, would pull her back and shove her down again so that Christa could continue her attack. And this time she chuckled and pulled the box cutter out of her pocket. Tadaryl would tell Colleen at this point to take off her shirt so she would be less likely to run away again. And Christa started slicing at her stomach with the box cutter. Colleen would scream and beg for her to stop, but Christa would tell her to shut up and that it was easier to hurt someone if they weren't trying to talk to you. Tadaryl was feeling creative or inspired or something at this point, and he decided to carve a pentagram into Colleen's chest, while Christa pulled out the meat cleaver and sliced at Colleen's throat. She didn't do a great job here, though, because at this point Colleen is still alive and still begging for her life, saying she would just literally walk back to Florida without even returning to Job Corps to collect her belongings if she could just go. Christa would state that at this point she was just sitting here watching her bleed, and she would try and get up with what little strength she had left and try to escape, at which point Christa would take the box cutter and just drag it in a line down her back and knock her to the ground once again. Then she would take concrete and start bashing Colleen's head in. And this didn't take one attempt either, and I don't know how to say this correctly, but she was terrible at murdering, and it never should have happened to begin with. Poor Colleen suffered way more than she could have because Christa just, I guess, didn't have the strength to do it properly. I hope you get what I mean there. Anyhow, after a few bashes in the head with the concrete block, Colleen was still gargling, and they dragged her to the wood pile where she was ultimately found. Christa would grab a piece of her skull that had fallen off during the attack and place it in her pocket, and the 3 students went back to the campus like nothing had happened, except for the fact that 4 students logged out that day and 3 logged back in, and poor Colleen's body would be discovered just 2 days later. In the meantime, Christa was sealing her own fate by bragging to the other students that she had killed Colleen, even going as far to show them the skull fragment that she had kept and the blood spatter on her shoes. An autopsy would show 6 gaping neck wounds and so many smaller slash wounds that the doctor performing the autopsy is said to have thrown her arms up and wrote innumerable superficial slash marks instead of lettering them by the alphabet as is custom. She said it would have taken her 3 days and a few alphabets to do so. Can you even imagine? They would also reconstruct Colleen's skull to demonstrate that the piece of the skull that they found in Christa's jacket was in fact the missing piece from Colleen's head. Not that it would really be necessary because Christa would provide them with a full confession, and it was 46 pages long when transcribed. In the end, Christa Pike would be sentenced to death for the murder of Colleen Slemmer, making her the youngest woman in U.S. history to be sentenced to death, and this was her reaction.
I left the future in the mode prescribed by law, and that she shall be transferred to the custody of the warden at the Tennessee Prison for Women. And further, on the 12th day of January 1997, your body shall be subjected to shock by a sufficient current of electricity. Oh God, have mercy upon you. Mr. Bates, take Mr. Pike into the house.
Can I please have my mom before I go?
Mr. Bates, please hold Miss Pike in the dock.
Please, let me just love my mom.
Please hold Miss Pike in the dock.
I love you. I love you too. And I love you too.
That's hard to watch, isn't it? Just looking at her and how helpless she seems here makes it hard to picture her committing the acts I just described, or is that just me? She is still attempting to appeal her sentence, and her most recent appeal was denied in 2023. If they do end up executing her, she will be the first woman to be put to death in Tennessee in over 200 years. Tadaryl Shipp would receive a life sentence, but he will be up for parole in 2026, so stay tuned. And Shadala Peterson would receive 6 years of probation after pleading guilty to being an accessory to the murder. So like I said, Christa is still the youngest woman in history to be sentenced to death in the U.S. She was 18 years old when she killed Colleen and 20 years old when she was sentenced to death. The big question in this case became not did Christa kill Colleen, but did she deserve to die for killing Colleen? I myself am not a supporter of the death penalty, although I do see some practical reasons to have it. But for argument's sake, if we are for the death penalty, does Christa deserve to die for killing Colleen? Depends who you ask. Poor Colleen is reported to have suffered at the hands of primarily Christa, but also Tadaryl for at least a half hour, possibly up to an hour, where she was tortured and forced to beg for her life before ultimately having her head bashed in. How does someone become capable of that? Sometimes people are born that way, but more often they've experienced some level of torture themselves, and in Christa's case, this is no exception. This girl was basically tortured her whole life. Before we get into that though, Christa wrote this letter to Tadaryl 2 days after she was sentenced. You see what I get for trying to be nice to that hoe? I went ahead and bashed her brains out so she'd die quickly instead of letting her bleed to death and suffer more. And they fry me. Ain't that some? Sounds like she definitely has a warped sense of what's acceptable. She basically believed that she had assaulted Colleen to the point of no going back. And in one sense, I mean, look at what she did, but you can always go back. Sure, it would have been terrible. She would have gotten in trouble, but she probably wouldn't be on death row. Anyways, to understand this mindset, we have to go back a bit. I'm going to tell you a little more about Christa's backstory, not to justify her actions at all, but to paint a better picture of her and maybe give you more understanding as to why she did what she did. So Christa, and honestly for this part of the story, it is going to be poor Christa. She was abused from the time... No, she was abused even before she was born, as her mom was apparently a raging alcoholic and did not stop drinking while she was pregnant with Christa. She drank so much that Christa should not have even been born, and yet she was, but it didn't get better from there. Fetal alcohol syndrome damages the frontal lobe of the infant, and that is significant because the frontal lobe is what helps us distinguish right from wrong. So there's that. Then it is reported that while her parents were still together, neither of them could be bothered to care for Christa. Then they would each go to see other people, and neither household could be considered a safe haven for Christa. Her father's house was abusive, and her mother was neglectful. Her mother would leave Christa alone to go party, and she wouldn't clean. And I'll admit cleaning isn't my favorite thing, and I'm not going to judge a little mess, but I'm talking your infant is crawling around in dog feces, putting their hands in their mouth type of mess. Christa would also have seizures from time to time, and her mother did not care. Did not care as in would stay out partying when Christa was rushed to the hospital because of these seizures, leaving her with whoever was caring for her at the time. Her maternal grandmother would watch her from time to time when her parents couldn't or wouldn't watch her, but she was basically like Christa's mother. But add to that she specifically didn't like Christa because she looked like her father. So there would be abuse at this home as well. Apparently her paternal grandmother was a decent lady, but her boyfriend would sexually abuse Christa. And once this came to light fairly early, her grandmother would give the guy the boot and go on to be the one positive figure in Christa's life until she died of cancer in 1998. When she died, Christa would attempt to take her own life. She was only 12 when this happened, and because her grandmother had become her only available safe place, she was about to go back to a series of just bad placements, frankly. Her mother would have a string of boyfriends who were often abusive, one going as far as punching her in the face, and at her father's, one of her half-sisters would claim that Christa had molested her, which caused him to send her away. Christa was raped by her family members, boyfriends, and then two separate strangers on two separate occasions when she was just out in public. And every time, no one would believe her because she had developed a reputation for becoming a pathological liar. And the two rape incidences were proved to have happened, but the people closest to her didn't believe her, which is very sad. And then she would join Job Corps hoping to better her life, but unfortunately all of that displaced anger from just years of abuse and no one believing her. Can you imagine? It seems like she just ended up snapping and making a really terrible choice. So the two aggravating factors that ended up sealing Christa's fate were as follows. The murder was especially heinous and atrocious or cruel in that it involved torture or serious physical abuse beyond that necessary to produce death. And the second is that the murder was committed for the purpose of avoiding, interfering, or preventing a lawful arrest or prosecution of the defendant or another. I have to agree. I think the torture and the countless times that poor Colleen begged for her life, I think if we're going to have the death penalty, Christa, you've certainly earned yourself a seat in that chair. Because I know I say this a lot, especially lately, but even if you suffer terrible abuse, it does not give you the right to go out and hurt people. It just doesn't. Christa's defense would argue that her age made her a candidate for rehabilitation. Unfortunately, Christa herself would kind of put a nail in that argument for future appeal because on August 24th of 2001, Christa would attack a fellow inmate with a shoelace attempting to strangle her. She almost succeeded as well, but luckily Patricia Jones escaped with her life, and Christa was convicted of attempted first-degree murder in August of 2004. Then, as if that wasn't enough, in March of 2012, she convinced a corrections officer to help her escape, but their plan was thwarted by the Tennessee Department of Corrections. Okay, I know I said I was against the death penalty, but again, if we're going to have it, she's causing problems even on death row. Yikes. One of her jurors would sum it up perfectly with the statement, "She has an angel's face and the devil's heart." And that's gonna do it. But as always, let's try to end today on a positive note. In the summer of 2015, the Job Corps where the whole story began in Knoxville, Tennessee, was torn down. Colleen's mother counts it as a small win, stating that it should have been torn down 20 years prior. She says that it's part of her closure and that she will feel the rest of this closure when they put Christa to death and return the portion of Colleen's skull that is still being held in evidence. Can you imagine? Apparently the program had some difficulties in the past, but the incident forced them to shut down. It's unfortunate when a program that is started to help people in a community brings more harm than good to that community. At least in this case, that's the impression that I'm getting. Irregardless, when the program closed down, the crime rates in Knoxville returned to normal levels. So that's good. Anyways, guys, I'll be back next week with gluttony. I've been spending last week at the fair, and I'll be at another fair all next week, and fair food. I've got some confessing to do. But I hope you all have a fantastic week, and remember, we all get angry. It's what you do with that anger that could become a problem, or in this case, a deadly sin. All right, stay safe out there. Bye.